Hello, today I'm going to be teaching you all about exposure in macro photography, so stay tuned. Hello, my name is Constantine. Welcome to my channel on macro photography, where I like to make little things a big deal. Today I want to go over all about exposure when it comes to macro photography, and this really is part of a larger subject of understanding light when it comes to your photographic journey and how light affects your image. In photography, it's not necessarily about the image or the subject. It's actually about the light and how the light interacts with the subject, where the bright parts are, where the shadows are, how full amount of light you get in an image. And I'm a bit of a geek, so we're going to use some D&D figures to try and explain these things. And this is sort of part of a series that I'm going to go into where we learn all about the manual settings on your camera and how to use that, because understanding your camera, whether you use a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, is very, very important. Understanding of your camera and all its settings is really important, so you know what you can change, when you can change it, how you can change it, how quickly you can change it in an instant, so that you're not fiddling around too much. You want to be able to capture that insect or whatever it is you're shooting if you're in the wild before it runs away on you and you no longer get that image. Studio macro photography is a little bit different, as you might be able to have some control. You can take your subject and put it back if you have a live subject, and you have more control in that instance. But out in the wild, much, much harder. So with these, all this is going to detail how to use the manual settings on your camera. And these are something that most point and shoots do not allow you to do. They tend to have some of the scene modes, including a macro or close-up mode in reality, landscape and portraiture, and an automatic mode, of course. Very few point and shoot cameras have a manual mode where you can change all the little settings that you need to change. This is one of the reasons you want to get a proper digital camera for your macro work. When you talk about exposure, you're really talking about how much light is in your image, how much light hits your subject. If you have a good balance of light and shadow in your subject, we say the image is properly exposed. If you have too much light, we say the image is overexposed. And if you don't have enough light, we say that the image is underexposed. You can test this very, very easily just by playing with the exposure slider in Lightroom and seeing what kind of effect it has on your image. Overall, when it comes to exposure, there are 5 things that you can change to control this. 3 of those things are on your camera. They are ISO, or how sensitive your sensor is to the light. In traditional days, there was a different ISO film, and you would say it was either slow film or fast film, just by how sensitive it was to the light. The aperture setting of your lens, how small or wide you make it. And finally, the shutter speed, how fast that shutter clicks to take your image. All this affects the amount of available light to give your image exposure. And I'm going to do a video, on each of these subjects. So please stay tuned. Click that like button, click that subscribe button. It's very, very important, and you won't miss a single episode. All these settings on your camera encompass what we call the exposure triangle. And you can see in the image here before you that adjusting these settings will either make things brighter or darker, depending on where you are. ISO, brighter, darker. Shutter speed, darker, brighter. Aperture, darker, brighter. Now there are 2 settings that are not on your camera that you can control. and I'm going to go over these in particular in this video. The first is the distance you have to your subject. Now, in macro photography, we tend to work with a very close distance because you want all that detail in your subject. But the closer you get to your subject, the less amount of light your camera sees. For example, I have this setup right here, a simple continuous light and my D&D figure. The light is a certain distance from the subject. I am shooting a little bit further away from the subject to get this result. We can see in the image that there is lots of light. I can see the figure fully. But if I get closer to the image and take it at 1:1 macro, even with all the same settings on my camera, same shutter speed, same ISO settings, same aperture size, now there is suddenly a whole lot less light in my chosen area that I want to photograph. Now, if I adjust one setting on my camera, such as ISO, and do the same thing, I get this result. Notice that there is lots of light. And then if I zoom in and take it at 1:1 macro, there's still a decent amount of light in the image. Actually, it didn't turn out too bad. The other thing that you might be able to change in some situations is how close the light is to your subject. So if I change the distance of the light to my subject, here, the light is much closer, and then I reduce my ISO back down to the same as it was originally, I'm using the same shutter speed, same aperture, same ISO settings, and I take the image further back. Again, we see that there is lots of light in this image. And in continuous light, you tend to want to use a little bit higher ISO, but for the sake of argument, I went back to the original one here. Now, once again, if we go at 1:1 macro and zoom in, notice that there is still less light on the subject, but because the light is closer, I'm not seeing quite as much change in the light on my image. Both of these images are properly exposed. The type of light and whatnot can be changed from a continuous light to sunlight to a flashlight to a speed light on your camera. All these things produce different light temperatures and affect the type of light that actually exposes your image. Stay tuned next week where we're going to go over ISO in a lot more detail. Until then, remember that in the macro world, we make little things a big deal. See you next week.